I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 16. Race Against Time. Kosovo, Camp Bondsteel. Lieutenant Colonel Seth Mitchell was exhausted. His back had been spasming on him, and he still felt sore from the IED attack that had nearly killed him several days ago. He started thinking about the sensation of the vehicle rolling over and over, feeling weightless for just a moment. He thought about Master Sergeant Nance and the embassy's RSO. Fortunately, both had survived. They were a bit banged up and worse for the wear, but they'd pull through. Both men had been flown back to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany before being sent back to the U.S. "Hey, come back to reality," said General Lancaster as he snapped his fingers a couple of times in front of Seth. Letting a yawn slip past his control, Seth stood up and stretched his body, forcing a couple of loud pops and cracks. "I need some coffee and a Flexeril for my back," Seth replied. He walked over to the back of the ops center. He reached for a heated plate which had a fresh pot of coffee sitting on it and another one already brewing. He poured some of the Death Wish brand coffee into one of the mugs, then swiftly lifted the black liquid to his lips and took a couple of gulps. He walked back over to Lancaster, coffee in hand. "Any word yet on where Tahir Shikri is, or if his body was in the building we leveled?" Seth asked. Lancaster looked frustrated at the question. He shook his head. "Unfortunately, no. We don't have any DNA to compare against the bodies from the safe house we blew up. The agency insists he's still alive. They said they had a SIGINT hit a few hours ago that matched his voice." Just then, one of the sergeants who'd been working with the NSA on tracking down the last terrorist leader jumped out of his seat. "We found him!" he shouted. "Whoa, soldier," said Chief Moore. "Calm down and show us what you found." The sergeant pointed to the computer monitor. "Right here. One of the Reaper drones just intercepted a phone call with the voice print matched to Shikri." "Did we get a copy of the call?" asked Seth. "What did he say, and who is he talking to?" "They're still tracking down whoever was on the other end. It was just a quick 20-second call, but it originated in this village here. The NSA is still pinging the phone from the Reaper. It appears the phone must be moving on foot, as it's moving slowly and through some rough terrain." "Holy cow, those NSA boys are good," said General Lancaster. He reached for the phone that would link him back to the SOCOM Ops Center at MacDill. A few minutes went by as Lancaster brought his boss up to speed and worked on getting permission to go capture Shikri. While he was on the phone, one of the soldiers that was listening in remarked, "Shouldn't we just hit him with the hellfire from the Reaper?" Chief Moore shot him a disapproving look. "Sure, if we don't want to find out what they're going to attack on Election Day, or who all is involved in the attack, maybe it doesn't matter to you who's funding them or providing them with the weapons or explosives, huh?" The soldier's face turned red as he realized just how stupid his comment had been. He went back to manning the weapon system on the Reaper without another word. General Lancaster finished his call. "We're a go," he announced. "Get the unit spun up. I want them ready to roll in the next hour." A flurry of activity began as Lieutenant Colonel Patrick "Paddy" Main from JSOC got his guys ready to launch. General Lancaster looked at Moore. "Chief, I need your group to start working up the targeted area. Figure out what's there. See if our Serbian LNO has any information he can offer us," he ordered. Then the general turned to Seth. "I need you to get with Smith and his ORA guys. We need to have a game plan ready for when we capture this joker. We don't have much time to get what we need from him. We're down to less than 3 days from when the next terrorist attack is supposed to happen." Seth nodded. "No pressure or anything," he thought. Seth headed out the door to walk over to where Smith and his group were working. They still had their 3 key prisoners under wraps. Between Smith and an interrogation group from DevGru and the unit, they'd been questioning these guys nearly non-stop since their capture. As Seth walked into the main room of the small detention facility, he immediately spotted Smith on the phone with someone. Smith made eye contact with Seth and waved for him to come over. Seth took a seat next to his colleague and waited for him to finish his call. When Smith hung up, he shot Seth a serious look. "Things are starting to go to hell in a handbasket back home, my friend," he said. Seth's brows furrowed. "What does that mean?" "I mean, things are starting to spiral out of control faster than we can stop them." "You're going to have to be a bit more specific," Seth responded. Sighing, Smith leaned in so the others around them couldn't hear. "I just got done talking with my boss." Seth interrupted. "Who exactly is your boss?" Smith waved the question off. "That's not important. What he told me hasn't been made public yet, but someone poisoned the Supreme Court justices." With a look of surprise, Seth asked, "Which one?" Smith shook his head. "No, you misheard me. It wasn't one of them. It was all of them. The FBI is trying to figure out when it happened, or if there are others in the government being targeted. It appears they were poisoned with polonium-210. Seth sat there in a state of shock at the news before replying. Wow. How the hell could that have happened? The two of them sat there for a moment, not saying anything. Smith finally broke the silence. "No one knows the details yet, but this isn't good. Have you been following anything with the election?" Seth shook his head. "I've been too busy. And frankly, I usually just try to ignore politics." "Well, you might want to start paying a little more attention right now. Apparently, our Chinese national, who's been spilling his guts, has been involved in a much bigger conspiracy than we originally thought. You did hear about all those postal workers being arrested for tampering with election ballots, right?" Seth was starting to feel like an idiot living under a rock. He hadn't heard anything about what was going on back home. He'd been so focused on what was happening here, right in front of them, he'd blocked everything else out. Seth held up his hands in mock surrender. "Okay, Smith, you caught me. I've been a little preoccupied with these dirtbags we've been chatting up. I have no idea what you're talking about." Smith shook his head disapprovingly. "Seth, you need to do better than that, my friend. You can't stay living in the dark. Everything we've been uncovering here has been getting actioned back home. It's created quite the uproar and circus. Heck, the president even tried to postpone the election until the terrorist threat had been successfully averted. He even went so far as to void all the absentee and mail-in ballots once it was discovered the Chinese Ministry of State Security was involved in stealing them." Seth just sat there, stunned at what Smith had just told him. He had no idea things were falling apart like this back home. Come to think of it, he hadn't called to talk to his wife in 2 days. She was probably worried sick about him. "I need to call Dana later today when things slow down," he resolved. Then Seth snapped himself back to the task at hand. "Smith, not to ignore what you just told me, but the reason I came over here was because the boss wants me to find out what the plan is for when we catch Shikri." Looking surprised, Smith asked, "Did we find him?" Now it was Seth's turn to be the guy in the know. "Yeah, the NSA just located him. The general's spinning up the unit to go after him right now. We may have him in custody in a few hours. So what's the plan? How are we going to get what we need from him?" he asked. "I think it's pretty simple, Seth. We keep using what's been working. You got some good information from the last couple of guys with your bag of pharmaceutical tricks. I say we keep going with that." "Did you bring the eye with you?" asked Seth. Smith smirked. "Yeah, of course I did. You really think you'll have time to do that kind of interrogation? Why not just stick to the drugs? They work faster for what we're doing." I don't know. It's an extra tool, Seth responded. Just make sure you have it out, so I can find it when the time comes. I think I'd like to try that thing first, before I go back to using the fire drug. No worries, Smith said. I'll have a solid packet of information for you on Shikri in a few hours, if your snake eaters catch him. I've had my guys busy tracking everything down and then some. Seth nodded, then left the detention facility to head back toward the dining facility to grab some breakfast. He did a calculation of the time zones. It was late in Florida, but he knew Dana would rather be woken up than not to hear from him. He dialed his wife's number. "Seth, is that you?" asked Dana groggily. God, it's so good to hear her voice right now, he thought. Yeah, it's me, baby. How are you and the kids? We're doing okay. How are you? Are you coming home soon? She asked. Not right now, honey. Things are too hot here, he said, his voice betraying some of the sadness he felt. Honestly, things were so busy, I hadn't even heard about the ballots that were stolen, or the election being postponed or anything. I guess I need to call more often. You always did keep me up to date on the important things in the news. Oh, babe. Yeah, it's really crazy here, Dana replied. At least they stopped those terrorist attacks on Halloween. I know you're doing things that are really important and making a difference right now, but the selfish side of me just wishes you were here. She sighed. Eric has been having nightmares like every other night. Half of the time I just end up letting him sleep in the bed with me. Lily keeps trying to get me to drive her to school, but this time it's because she keeps telling me that a terrorist is more likely to target a school bus than a car. They're growing up too fast. The world is scary. Dana, I'm so sorry you have to handle all that, Seth replied. I'll have to call when it's a better time of day to talk to them. Maybe I can help reassure them for you. That would be great, honey. If you could, it would really help. She paused. Listen, as much as I want to talk to you more, I'm just so tired right now. It's been a lot of late-night conversations lately. Is there any chance we could talk more after I've had a chance to sleep? Yeah, of course. Rest up, darling. I'll keep doing what I can on this end to stop all this madness. I love you. I love you too, she replied. Come home to me safely. Linka, Serbia, 10 kilometers northwest of Preševo. Cool air whipped through the open cabin on the Black Hawk, but the 6 Delta Force operators remained laser-focused as they prepared themselves for an incredibly dangerous daytime extraction of a high-value target. Following the lead Black Hawk were 2 more of the flying chariots, carrying 16 Army Rangers who'd provide the ground security of the area once the Delta operators landed to carry out the hit. They'd cover the extraction and make sure no unforeseen forces showed up to interfere in this high-stakes capture. Flying slightly above the troop-carrying helicopters was a pair of Apache gunships. Like a pair of sheepdogs, they'd make sure no unwanted advances were made toward the soldiers below. Further above the formation loitered a lone Reaper drone, armed with 4 Hellfire missiles, ready to provide additional ground support should it be needed. With less than 48 hours until the next terrorist attack and the U.S. elections, the DoD was under immense pressure to find and subsequently capture the terrorist leader whose members were even now positioning themselves to carry out their next attack. Master Sergeant Bruce Deuce Wilder did a final check of his harness and weapon as the Black Hawk sped toward the Serbian border. Looking at the faces of the other operators, he saw they were ready for some payback. The last raid to capture this HVI had resulted in a handful of SEALs getting injured and killed, not to mention the loss of 2 helicopters. He'd eluded capture once, but he wasn't going to pull it off a second time. Sergeant First Class Larry Flint, who just went by Larry rather than some call sign, was going to assault the front of the building with him, along with Sergeant First Class Pedro Spider Santos, their breacher. He'd be responsible for blowing the front door down, gaining them entrance into the building. The other 3 operators that would leave the helicopter via the other door would move quickly to the rear of the building and breach from there, ensuring no one was able to escape out the back entrance. If things went according to plan, they'd be in the building and clear it in less than 3 minutes. Deuce held on to the edge of the helicopter as his feet dangled below the lip of the cargo bay. The helicopter picked up speed and banked hard to the left, cutting down another valley as it neared the target location just across the Kosovo border into Serbia. The other helicopters in their entourage were doing the same, following them as they flew just feet above the bare trees of the valley below. 3 minutes, shouted the crew chief over the roar of the whooshing air. Their objective was located in a small, mountainous village just north of the Muslim enclave of Preševo. It had been rumored that this area was controlled by an Albanian Muslim extremist group. It was also a site where a number of different atrocities had been committed by both the Serbian MUP forces and the Albanian terrorist groups that dominated the area. The animosity between the Orthodox Christian Serbs and the ethnic Albanian Muslims had boiled over dozens of times there, resulting in some horrific atrocities by both parties. The crew chief turned around to face the operators again. "We're coming up on the target now," he shouted. The 2 gunners swiveled their M134 miniguns toward the nearby buildings that were rapidly coming into view. The nose of the helicopter flared up as the tail boom dropped, rapidly bleeding speed off, as the helicopter went from traveling more than 100 miles per hour to a near hover over the targeted landing zone. In seconds, the helicopter was on the ground and the operators were launching themselves from the metal beast to the ground. They raced toward their target, a small cluster of buildings that made up the center of this small little village. Deuce brought his weapon to bear and ran toward the building. The rotor wash blew brownish leaves and loose dirt everywhere as the pilot applied power to get the helicopter back in the air. Seconds later, Deuce and his team were practically to the main door when the first target emerged, a young man in his early 20s wielding an AK-74. Deuce squeezed the trigger once, sending a short burst of fire into the man's chest, hurling him back against the door he had just emerged from. The operators continued their relentless charge toward the targeted building, knowing that speed was life in this situation. They needed to hit the building now, while the occupants were still confused by what was happening and before they could get organized and repel their attack. Deuce was now practically to the front of the building. His 2 comrades moved to the left of the front door, while he moved to the right side, near a bay window that allowed the occupants to see outside. 100 meters to their right and left, the other 2 Blackhawks were landing, dropping off the 16 Army Rangers who would focus on securing the perimeter of the village. As Deuce neared the front of the building, the window closest to him exploded. AK-74 rounds shattered the glass and tore through the wall above, below, and to the right and left of the window frame as the shooters sought to kill the men trying to assault their building before they could breach the entrance. Deuce reached for one of the M84 flashbang grenades on his vest. Clenching it in his hand, he pulled the pin and tossed it into the destroyed window. More bullets tore into the wall inches from his face and body as the occupant inside tried to kill him. Boom! The grenade exploded, and the shooting momentarily stopped. Spider, Deuce's partner, had managed to slap a strip of det cord to the outer edge of the door. As soon as the bullets were silenced, he blew the door open. Deuce and Larry rushed in, sweeping for threats. The lone shooter who'd been desperately trying to kill them moments earlier was writhing in pain on the ground, still feeling the effects of the stun grenade and the door being blown in. Larry ran up to the downed shooter and kicked him hard in the groin with his steel-toed boot. Then he dropped down to a knee, turned the man over, and zip-tied his hands with the flex cuffs they had brought for this purpose. Deuce ran past Larry with Spider hot on his heels. They raced up to the second floor of the building in search of their HVI. Just as they were about to reach a turn in the stair, the wall in front of them exploded in splinters. A shooter on the second floor peppered the staircase with bullets. Deuce dropped to a knee as a string of bullets flew right over where his head had just been. Spider quickly tossed another stun grenade up to the landing. Boom! As soon as the grenade went off, Deuce was back up on his feet, running up the rest of the stairs 3 at a time. When he reached the top, he found the shooter sitting motionless with his back against the wall, his AK-74 sitting in his lap. Deuce kicked the man's weapon out of his lap and then pounced on him. He punched the guy as hard as he could with his right hand and then forced the man over onto his belly. Yanking the man's hands behind him, he grabbed the flex cuffs off his vest and cinched them tight on the man's hands, immobilizing him. While Deuce manhandled his shooter, Spider had already bounded past him and burst into one of the bedrooms. Deuce heard a string of bullets being fired and raced to help cover his comrade. He came through the entrance just in time to see Spider launch himself at a man, knocking his rifle loose from his hands. The two of them tumbled onto a bed. Spider kneed the shooter as hard as he could in the groin, then rolled him over onto his belly. He grabbed for his flex cuffs and got them on the man, cinching them tight on his wrists and neutralizing him as a threat. Just as Deuce began to think that Spider had the situation under control, he saw a figure skulking toward the back door. Crap, Shikri is about to escape, he realized. Bam! The door blew inwards, throwing Shikri into the wall behind him. He slumped down to the ground, holding his chest. The concussion of the blast had likely knocked the wind right out of him. One of the other operators busted in through the hole in the wall, throwing Shikri onto his belly. The man had him zip-tied before he had any chance to respond. He coughed several times, trying to regain his breath, and the man sat his new prisoner up. Deuce smiled at the success of their mission, and then he thought about the view Shikri had. He was staring at a soldier with a close-cropped beard, tactical helmet and ballistic glasses, body armor covered in hand grenades, stun grenades, magazine pouches, and another pair of flex cuffs for good measure. Then his eyes focused on the camouflage Velcro Punisher patch just above another Velcro patch with his blood type, O positive. Deuce chuckled. He's probably asking himself who in the world we are, he thought. After making sure the situation was secure, Deuce grabbed the man from the top of the landing and helped guide him down the staircase so they could get the house cleared and start to search for anything of value that might help the intelligence guys track down the remaining terrorists in the U.S. Spider had his prisoner behind him and was doing the same. When they reached the ground floor, they moved the two men out the front door to where the other members of their team had the other prisoners from the building, sitting Indian style on the ground. With two of the operators guarding the 4 prisoners, the rest of the team was inside the building, grabbing everything that might be of intelligence value. At this point, the Army Rangers had moved in closer to their position and reported spotting no additional threats. A handful of civilians who lived in the immediate area cautiously came out of their homes but kept their distance. The operators must have seemed like a mystery to them, because unlike the Serbian MUP or other police units they might have seen in the past, Deuce and his fellow soldiers were heavily loaded down with weapons and equipment. They quietly mingled with each other. A few minutes went by relatively uneventfully before the familiar sound of helicopters returned. The first to appear were the 2 Apache helicopters, which stayed in a low hover on opposite ends of the village, making their presence known and ensuring no one decided to take a pop shot at them. Next came a series of Blackhawks and a lone Chinook. The Chinook landed first, which allowed the operators to load up their 4 prisoners and the half-dozen large black bags of evidence they'd grabbed from the building. The 6 Delta Force members hopped in the bird as well to escort their HVI back to Bondsteel. Next came the 2 Blackhawks, which would collect up the Rangers. When the last helicopter lifted off and was safely out of the village, the 2 Apaches turned away and followed their charges back across the Serbian border into Kosovo. Deuce smiled. This was what he lived for. It had been a successful mission with no casualties and only 1 terrorist killed. Seth looked at the naked, shivering image of Tahir Shikri as he sat there, tied to the metal chair with a black hood over his face. They hadn't placed the sensory deprivation equipment on him just yet. Seth wanted to save that for later, when he wanted to make his prisoner believe he'd been held for far longer than he really had. Right now, It was far more important for him to be unsure of where he was being held and what was about to happen to him next. Unfortunately, Seth and Smith didn't have much time to get the information they needed to stop the next set of terrorist attacks. Seth nodded to one of the two guards standing in the room to remove the black hood covering his face. As the hood came off, Shikri crinkled his eyes a bit, trying to adjust to the poor lighting of the room. Seth had readjusted the setting for his purposes. A single light bulb hanging from the ceiling was barely illuminating the place with its yellowish glow. Ominous shadows filled in the rest. Seth stepped forward to allow himself to be illuminated and waited for Shikri's gaze to settle on him. When his prisoner finally made eye contact, Seth saw the look of fear and anger in his eyes. "Are you thirsty?" Seth asked. "Would you like some water?" Shikri opened his mouth as if to say something, but then quickly closed it. Seth had seen this before. His detainee didn't want to admit he needed anything. Seth took a bottle of water and placed it on the table in front of him anyway. Seeing that Shikri's arms were still zip-tied to the chair, Seth signaled to one of the guards to cut him loose. He obliged, pulling out a knife and quickly cutting through the plastic ties that held him to the chair. Then the guard sheathed his knife and stepped back into the shadows, out of sight but ever present should he be needed. Shikri stared at the water bottle, unsure of whether he should take it or not. "Drink," Seth commanded, miming the action with his right hand. The interpreter, who sat in a chair behind the prisoner, also hidden in the dark, echoed Seth's instructions. Reluctantly, Shikri grabbed the water bottle, unscrewed the cap, and then proceeded to drain most of it in several large gulps. "Would you care for something to eat?" Seth asked. Shikri looked at him quizzically. Before his prisoner had a chance to decline, Seth waved a hand and the door to the room opened up, allowing a stream of light from the hallway to shine in. A lone figure appeared in the doorway, and a man walked in, holding a tray with 8 chicken wings, some olives, and some fresh-cut fruit. He placed the tray down in front of Shikri and walked out. The prisoner looked at the plate of food longingly and skeptically, obviously unsure if the food had been spiked with something or what to make of it all. Seth smiled. He knew that when Shikri had been captured, he'd fully expected to be tortured, not fed and taken care of. His campaign of confusion was having the desired effect. Suddenly, Shikri began to shiver. Then he looked down at himself. It was as if he rediscovered that he was naked, sitting on a metal chair in a room that had an ambient temperature of about 55 degrees Fahrenheit. "I'm sorry for your initial treatment, Shikri," said Seth comfortingly. "They shouldn't have stripped you naked like this. You are still a human being, and you should be treated with respect." Seth snapped his fingers, and one of the guards brought over a blanket. "Stand up," he ordered. When Shikri had complied, he wrapped the blanket around the man, and then he sat back down, visibly more comfortable. Seth observed his prisoners staring at the food again. "Eat," he said. "I'll wait until you've had your fill before the two of us talk." Shikri's instincts took over, and he began scarfing down the food as if he hadn't eaten in 2 weeks. Seth observed the man as he ate, looking for signs that the drugs he'd injected into Shikri's water were having the desired effects. His eating had slowed a bit, and he began to fumble with his plastic fork. Excellent, Seth thought. His prisoner was oblivious to what was happening to him, but his mind was being lulled into a place of tranquility and peace. A sense of euphoria would start to take over, as any inhibition he had would start to fade away. During the next 5 or so minutes, Seth made casual conversation with the man sitting before him, asking him if he had made the pilgrimage to the Hajj, and sharing his own story of the pilgrimage experience he'd had several years prior. Given Seth's pilgrimage had been done for covert reasons during an operation he was a part of in Yemen, but he was still able to share some of that experience with Shikri, who now showed a bit more respect to Seth than he had just a few minutes prior. Sharing the same experience created a bond that Seth could build on. In his life back in the States, Seth actually attended a Baptist church, but he knew enough about Islam that he could easily pass himself off as a Muslim when the situation required, like right now, during his interrogation of this terrorist mastermind. Now that Shikri had finished his food, he asked, "How can a Muslim, a brother in the faith, work for such a godless atheist government? How can you work against us? We are doing the work of Allah. What are you doing?" Seth nodded at the question. "We all do the work of Allah in our own ways, Shikri. We all bear his burdens differently." "You should be working with us, not against us for these infidels," his prisoner countered. Seth shook his head. "You have it all wrong, brother. While you wage the smaller jihad against the West, I wage the great jihad, the jihad against the mind, the body, which is far more difficult than the war you wage against flesh and blood." "You are trying to warp my sense of honor, my sense of purpose," Shikri replied angrily. "Brother, the West will be defeated in the coming decades when the Muslim faithful outbreed these infidels. There is no need for violence when through procreation we will outnumber them. Elect leaders that agree with our interpretation of Sharia and our values and way of life. It is only a matter of being patient, brother." Shikri sat there, looking at Seth for a moment, almost dumbfounded by what he'd said. He seemed to be mulling over whether or not what the man before him said could possibly be true. Now that Seth had Shikri thinking, and he was sure that the drugs were having the desired effect, he began to lay his foundation. "Look, we know your terrorist group is planning to carry out an attack in America during the election. I could torture you and get the information I'm looking for, but why? I don't want to torture a fellow Muslim, a brother in Allah. In the end, Allah will defeat the West, but he'll defeat them through peace and showing them his love, not his hate. I want you to tell me what you are planning to do. How many of your followers are involved, and where will these attacks take place?" Seth leaned in. "We can't defeat the West through Allah's love and by outbreeding them if we cause them to fear Allah and lash out at his followers. Please see that you are imperiling a much greater jihad in the West by carrying out an attack that will only hurt the rest of our Muslim brothers and sisters." Then, very softly, Seth asked, "Do you understand?" Shikri stared at Seth with an unsure look. The drugs were clearly causing him to have a hard time thinking. After a moment, he shook his head. "No. No. I cannot betray my people," he said. "We've trained too long and too hard for this day. This is our chance to strike at the heart of the great Satan." "How is your strike at the great Satan going to be any different than what has already been done? Is your group just another copycat of the previous groups?" asked Seth. Shikri snickered at the comment. "Oh, no. We are no copycats. We have been given help to make sure that our attack will be bigger and better than any previous attack." Seth smiled as he asked, "Then tell me, one Muslim brother to another, what it is. Tell me, so I can rejoice in your triumph and share in your joy." At this point, Seth had reached across the table and gently took hold of Shikri's hands as he looked into his eyes with about as much joy and excitement as a child would have when he saw his family's Christmas tree fully decorated and surrounded by beautifully wrapped gifts. A smile crept across Shikri's face. "Okay, fine. I'll share with you one of the attacks, but you'll have to wait for the others. They're a surprise." Chapter 17. birth of a new world order. New York, New York, United Nations Headquarters. Secretary General Johann Baer of the United Nations sat in his office, looking out the large windows at the great city of New York before him. From his perch, he could see much of Manhattan and the surrounding harbor and waterways. As much as he loved the energized scene before him, he despised the nation it belonged to. To him, the United States was a parasite, a leech that was bleeding the world dry. Its never-ending thirst for energy and resources, and its perverse belief that somehow its people were more important than those of any other nation, made it a dangerous scourge. American exceptionalism. More like American imperialism if they don't get what they want, Baer thought. Like a petulant child, America would routinely lash out at various countries of the world when it didn't get what it wanted, using its economy and its military to bully smaller countries into submission. He found comfort that those days were quickly coming to an end. Only a few more days and America and the world will change for the better. Mr. Secretary General, said his assistant, breaking his trance and bringing him back to reality. He turned to look at his assistant and saw him walk in, accompanied by a Canadian general, a man by the name of Guy Mackenzie. The Canadian general had built a well-known reputation both within his own country's forces and those of the UN as a true warrior diplomat. He'd spent large portions of his career in the Canadian Special Forces, and then in various functions developing the small Canadian military into a well-trained professional force. He'd been the commander of numerous UN peacekeeping operations around the world. The few UN-led peacekeeping operations that hadn't been plagued by scandal or marred by indifference, like those in South Sudan, were the ones specifically led by Mackenzie. When it came time to develop a true UN standing army, there wasn't a single military officer in the world that held the level of respect needed to make this concept work other than General Guy Mackenzie. Secretary General Baer smiled warmly at the two men as he stood up to greet them. He'd been waiting all day for this meeting. Walking around his desk, he shook both of their hands excitedly. "General, it's good to see you here in New York. How are things coming along?" "Rough around the edges, sir, but coming along," answered General Mackenzie in an upbeat tone. The Secretary General guided them over to a table at the far side of his office. "Please, General, tell me how things are going, and what more I can do to help, or make calls to get things moving faster for you," Baer pressed. Mackenzie nodded. "No disrespect, but is Mr. Vollmer cleared for this?" he asked, tilting his head toward Bruno Vollmer, who was sitting next to the general. Baer waved the comment off. "Bruno is fully aware of what we are doing. He's helping me orchestrate the political side of things here at the UN, so please feel free to speak freely in front of him." "Very well," General Mackenzie responded. Then he opened a locked pouch he had with him and pulled out some papers and a folder to begin their discussion. "The plans for the exercises are going well. We have advanced parties for the participating nations' militaries arriving this week. The United Nations Operation Restoring Order training exercise is shaping up to be a huge success." "Wait, what are you calling it?" asked Bruno with a quizzical look on his face. The name for the operation had only been settled on a few days ago, so it was still not widely known. We settled on calling it Operation Restoring Order, since that's essentially going to be the function of the new standing army. For short, we're calling the training exercise UNORO. I guess you'd pronounce it UNORO. "I don't mean to interrupt, but how many nations have finally agreed to participate?" Secretary General Baer eagerly asked. He'd been so busy trying to get the political side of this exercise taken care of that he hadn't been able to delve too deeply into the nuts and bolts of the details. General Mackenzie smiled. "As of right now, we have 42 nations participating in one form or another. The largest contributors to the exercise are France, Germany, Turkey, Belgium, The Netherlands, Norway, Spain, Italy, and surprisingly, China and Russia have agreed to send forces as well. Many of the other nations are contributing less than 100 soldiers, mostly observers who will presumably report back on how well things go or don't go, so their home nations can determine if they want to support it and how many soldiers they want to commit. When the exercise is complete, we'll have a better idea of how many nations will want to contribute forces long-term to the Standing Army. Once I have those figures, I'll be able to develop my report of how many soldiers we'll need to recruit to fill out the gaps in the force, and that'll tell us what the costs will be. Looking at one of the papers he had pulled out, Mackenzie added, "Of the major nations participating, this is the troop breakdown. China is sending a total of 3,500 soldiers, and most of the Chinese soldiers are part of their Air Force and Navy, no ground forces. Once they arrive in Vancouver, they will head to the Canadian Forces Base Comox, northwest of Vancouver. In addition to the Air Force, a total of 10 Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy ships will make a port call at Canadian Forces Base Esquimalt. The Russian Federation is sending 22,000 soldiers to participate in the exercises that will be taking place at the Canadian Forces Base in Trenton. In addition to the ground forces, the Russians are also going to send 2 squadrons of fighters to allow our NATO-based aircraft a chance to do some real training against some of their frontline fighters. We're actually really excited about this opportunity to train with the Russians and move from always viewing them as a foe to a new potential UN peacekeeping partner." Secretary General Baer grunted. He still had his suspicions about the Russians' motives, but at this point, he needed them. Germany is sending the largest contingent, 24,000 soldiers. Then France is sending 18,000 soldiers. He paused for a second as he rifled through the papers to find what he was looking for. Here it is. Turkey and Pakistan are sending a combined force of 9,000 soldiers, and the remaining countries have contributed a combined 17,000 soldiers. All in all, we're looking at having a total of 68,000 soldiers from all 42 nations. Baer let out a soft whistle. He was impressed that they were able to organize so many peacekeepers from so many different nations, in the dead of winter and traveling to Canada, no less. This is going to work out better than I'd hoped, he thought. "Incredible, General," Baer said. "Truly genius what you've been able to put together. This will be the largest UN military force since the Korean War." Smiling at the high praise, Mackenzie added, "And it'll have all been done without any help from the Americans. A true effort by the nations of the world without having to rely on the United States to accomplish it." "How are we getting all of these nations' military equipment moved to Canada?" Bruno asked as he jotted down a note. "Also, how long will the exercise last, and what are you doing to keep them all fed and occupied?" General Mackenzie smiled at the questions, obviously not at all put off. For decades, the United Nations peacekeeping forces have been poorly trained and poorly led because the organization has been dependent on receiving whatever forces each member state is willing to loan us. In many cases, we've been handed poorly trained and poorly equipped units as the member states hoped these units would receive the training and experience they themselves were unable to provide. They were essentially just giving us warm bodies with little skills or experience and expecting us to somehow stop a civil war or impose peace on a war-torn nation with these inadequate forces. Unfortunately, this has resulted in an abysmal peacekeeping record and tarnished the UN's name. In some cases, we've caused more harm than good. Our track record in South Sudan and Somalia is a good case in point. Mackenzie looked sad as he mentioned those 2 countries. But then he perked back up. This training exercise is meant to address many of those problems. Mostly it's meant to fix our logistical problem of shipping a military force to a foreign land and then keeping that force supplied. In this case, we're relying heavily on nations like the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, France, China, and Russia to do most of the heavy vehicle and equipment transport. Most of the equipment is due to arrive on the east and west coasts of Canada in the next couple of days. From there, it'll be shipped via rail to the various Canadian military bases until the soldiers start to fly in from around the world. Most of the soldiers will start to arrive in Canada around November 3rd. Within 5 days, all participating soldiers will have arrived and will begin collecting their equipment and begin the process of getting it ready. Pulling out a calendar, Mackenzie added, "The first day of the military exercises will be November 7th, and they will continue for a full 45 days. When they're done, there will be a 5-day period where we'll conduct an after-action review of all the soldiers involved to find out what went right and what went wrong, so we can work on fixing the problems as they're identified." Bruno smiled and nodded at the information. He wrote a few other things down on his pad of paper before returning his gaze back to the general. "What are the exact scenarios you'll be training for?" Mackenzie nodded. "Well, in this case, we'll be training for a couple of scenarios. The first scenario is a restart of the Korean War. In this scenario, we'll be training our combat forces to carry out joint maneuvers to deal with a much larger North Korean ground force. Mostly, it'll be a lot of maneuver training, having units shift around from one base to another under strict timelines, while pretending to meet a specific North Korean division. It's a giant logistics and supply exercise, which is a huge challenge for any army to have to deal with. The second scenario is more in line with our traditional peacekeeping missions, helping to restore order in a country after a coup, or working with a local government to prevent a coup. This exercise will result in a lot of community interactions between UN forces, and training in how to properly handle those interactions. We've utterly failed in those areas in the past, so it's a much-needed exercise. What these exercises will also do is allow us to identify specific officers and NCOs inside of each host nation that may be better suited for future UN missions. This way, when a call goes out for a UN force in, say, Gabon or Sierra Leone, we can request specific officers and their units from a host nation and know those individuals have been properly trained and will react correctly in certain situations. Leaning forward, Bear asked, "And what about our test of the American aerospace defense networks? Have those units been briefed on what to do and what to look for?" Mackenzie nodded. "Yes, our Canadian officers serving at the joint U.S.-Canadian bases will be monitoring things from their end. As to our side of the border, the Russians and Germans were most eager to have an opportunity to buzz an American airbase and practice carrying out mock bombing missions. It'll give us a good test of the American aerospace defense system." Secretary General Bear beamed with pride as Mackenzie finished his brief. He couldn't be prouder of the UN or what it was transforming itself into. Since his time as the German foreign minister, he'd wanted to see not just a strong, dominant European Union emerge as a counterweight to the U.S., but a strong and effective United Nations. For decades, the UN had not only been a bloated bureaucracy that had proven to be largely useless, it had lacked any real teeth to enforce its mandates and policies. How many resolutions had the UN passed sanctioning North Korea, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, or even Israel for their inhumane treatment of the Palestinians? None of them were worth the paper they were written on without a standing army to enforce their edicts. For too long, any semblance of a UN army was forced to be made up of U.S. forces. This would ultimately mean the UN was used once again as the U.S.'s proxy weapon to advance their causes, their goals, even if it went against the good of the world. Looking at General Mackenzie with pride, Bear felt he was finally on the cusp of having the very tool every past UN Secretary General lacked, a real military force that could enforce its mandates. Chapter 18. Fate of the Republic. November 2nd, 2020, Washington, D.C., J. Edgar Hoover Building, FBI Headquarters. The polls were now less than 36 hours from opening, and the FBI was still no closer to stopping the impending terrorist attacks than they had been 2 days earlier. The information they had received from Kosovo had enabled them to arrest 2 individuals, but they had yet to find the rest of their cell or the others involved in the plot. When they had raided the home being used by the 2 individuals, they had discovered something truly horrifying. Their 2019 GMC Savannah cargo van had been turned into a giant, mobile version of a Claymore anti-personnel mine. When the bomb squad had torn the vehicle apart, they'd seen that the inner walls of the van had been covered in several layers of tiny steel ball bearings. Behind the ball bearings was a layer of C4, which would act as the propellant that would throw the ball bearings in a wide arc away from the vehicle. The terrorists had even shaped steel plates to fit behind the explosives, to further ensure the pressure from the blast expanded out in the direction they wanted it to go. They had even marked the van to look like a police evidence van, complete with all of the proper markings, vehicle numbers, and everything needed to make it look official. They still hadn't figured out how the terrorists had planned on using it or where it was going to be detonated, but based on the type of explosives they'd found and the way it was configured with the ball bearings, they knew it was going to be used against a soft target, a place where lots of people would be gathering together. At precisely 9:07 a.m., Attorney General Malcolm Wright and one of his aides walked unannounced into FBI Director Nolan Polanski's office. Looking up, a bit surprised by the sudden appearance of the AG, he stammered, I wasn't expecting you, sir. What can I do for you?" With a bit of heat in his voice, Malcolm said, "I need to know where we stand in the questioning of these terrorists. You've had them in custody now for a day, and we still don't know who their co-conspirators are or where they are planning to carry out this next attack. I need answers, Nolan. I've got the president breathing down my neck, and the election is tomorrow." Angrily, Director Polanski shot back, "I don't know, Malcolm. We've been pressing them non-stop since we detained them. They've freaking lawyered up on us, and somehow the ACLU got wind that we've detained suspected terrorists, and now I've got them breathing down my back, demanding that they be arraigned and allowed representation." The FBI director slumped dejectedly in his chair, frustrated that his agents weren't getting the information they needed fast enough. He knew they were on the clock. A terrorist attack was going to happen tomorrow, and thus far he was powerless to stop it. Malcolm wasn't having it. He slammed his hand down on his desk, jarring Polanski back to reality. "Damn it, Nolan! You're the director of the FBI. Use every tool you have at your disposal to get them talking. As to the ACLU, tell me who's giving you grief and allow me to handle them. These guys fall under the Patriot Act. They have no rights. They don't get to see a lawyer. And furthermore, they're not even U.S. citizens. Get me answers, Nolan, and stop this terrorist attack from happening." The two of them sat there for a moment, staring at each other without saying a word, before Director Polanski finally nodded. He picked up the phone on his desk and spoke a few hushed words to someone on the other end. "I've relayed your concerns, Malcolm. They'll amp up the pressure on them." He crossed his arms. "You'd better not burn me on this later," he retorted. He was frustrated that while his agency wasn't breaking the rules, they were certainly about to bend them to get the answers the AG wanted in the time frame they were given. "If another attack happens, Nolan, it'll be both our heads. So let's just focus on getting these guys. Now, what have your people figured out regarding the poisoning of the Supreme Court justices?" Malcolm asked. "We believe they may have been poisoned while they were in deliberations sometime early last week. Sadly, the last 4 justices will die either today or sometime tomorrow. The radiation poisoning was just too severe for them to be saved." Shaking his head, the AG asked, Have we figured out how they were poisoned yet? The best we've been able to determine is that they were probably fed the poison in their drinks sometime last week. We've scoured the kitchen and interrogated all but one of the staff members that work there. The remaining staff member is on a pre-approved vacation, so we'll interview her when she returns. So far, we haven't been able to find any traces of the polonium. Chances are, whatever was used to poison them with has already been thoroughly cleaned, and the half-life of the stuff is fairly short. In a way, we're lucky it wasn't placed in the HVAC system of the building. Had it been, it could have poisoned hundreds of people. Malcolm snorted. I'm not as worried about a few hundred people being killed, so much as the fact that between today and tomorrow, all 9 Supreme Court justices will be dead at the same time. This is far more catastrophic to the fabric and stability of our nation than a few hundred visitors, lawyers, and petitioners before the court. The FBI director found himself in agreement at the morbid assessment. What's the president going to do about the justices? We can't have a Supreme Court completely unable to hear cases, especially given the current executive order about the election. Has anyone officially determined what's going to happen with that? We're kind of running out of options and time. Shaking his head, Malcolm rubbed the right side of his head with his hand. He looked at his colleague with sadness and uncertainty written on his face. I don't know, Nolan. I just don't know what to do anymore. The president needs to nominate new judges, but the country is still mourning their loss. Not to mention we have an election tomorrow that, in all honesty, is probably not going to be legit. You've seen the pundits and what the Tate campaign is putting out there. They've whipped people up, saying this whole terrorist plot and these postal workers the FBI arrested are just a diversion from Sachs losing. You and I know that's ridiculous, but how do we convince the other half of the country that's drinking the Tate Kool-Aid? We let the terrorists carry out their attack tomorrow. When they see a few dozen bombs go off, they'll know we weren't lying or making this crap up. The FBI director responded flippantly. He immediately regretted that he'd said that out loud, instead of keeping it in his head. Malcolm's jaw dropped in shock. Director Polanski held up a hand. I'm sorry, I didn't really mean that. I've gone over the TDAC report on the truck bomb we've already captured. These are horrific bombs if they do end up going off. Malcolm shook his head, obviously angry and disgusted. Look, Nolan, I know we're all under a ton of pressure, but pull it together, man. You've got thousands of agents looking to you for leadership right now. I may be out of a job depending on how the election goes tomorrow, but you'll still be here, and we need you to finish this job. You've got to find out who all is involved in this conspiracy. Someone deliberately poisoned the Supreme Court justices, just as they were about to hear perhaps the most important case in our generation. There are a series of terrorist attacks planned against our country. They weaponized social media to turn citizens against each other, and now we discover postal workers stealing the absentee ballots? You couldn't make this stuff up if you tried. And yet it's all happening right before our very eyes. Malcolm paused and leaned forward. You have to figure out who's behind all this before it's too late. The fate of our entire republic is hanging in the balance.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.